Hello and welcome to our program Where God Weeps. Oceania comprises a string of islands stretching from Asia to America. Some estimates calculate a total of 10,000 islands. This area is also home to about 30 million people. Today I have the privilege to welcome Cardinal George Pell of Sydney, Australia, to talk to him about the situation facing Catholics in the region of Oceania. Your Eminence, thank you for being with us here today.
Happy to be here, Mark. Happy to be here.
Your Eminence, you chose the words, "Be not afraid," as your episcopal motto. Why did you choose these words?
Well, I'll give you a half-serious answer, a partial answer.
Right.
Because some of my friends were very despondent about the way the church was going. They wondered whether the party was over. And some of my opponents thought that if the party wasn't over, I would finish the church off.
Great.
But more importantly, I think it answers the suspicion that Jesus is no longer with the church, is no longer with us, that we're faced with very bad times indeed. And if you know a bit of church history, there are many, many periods in church history where the situation has been much worse than it is in Australia and indeed in many parts of the Western world.
When did you decide to become a priest, and who or what was decisive in your decision?
Well, I thought of becoming a priest when I was at elementary school, primary school. I'd been quite sick off and on then. I went to secondary school and gave the idea away. I completed my secondary education. I had a place in law school, and I thought, no, I'll do something that's a bit more altruistic than law. I'll see if I can become a doctor. I was no good at chemistry, and halfway through my repeat of year 12, two uncles died within a month or so of one another, and I was quite good and very interested in English, and my religious brother, he died. And at school I was a big fish in a small pond, and quite dissatisfied. So my father wasn't a Catholic. He opposed my vocation, but my mother was a very strong Irish Australian Catholic, and the school where I was has produced more priests than any other school in Australia, over 300 priests in 110 years.
And these figures then were the decisive figures for you, your uncles and...
But no, I wouldn't. I'd say that with their death, they weren't decisive figures in themselves. But I felt that perhaps God wanted me to be a priest, and I was resisting that.
And was there a decisive moment, a click, where you said, this is it, now I know, this is my vocation?
No, I wasn't sure that I knew clearly, but I felt that I should try. And I think those 3 deaths forced me to reevaluate what I should be doing.
In Australia, Catholics represent about 27% of the population, and is, in fact, the largest, let's say, the strength of the Catholic Church in Oceania. And yet, these Catholic populations are presently in decline. Why is this, and how is the Church trying to respond?
Well, it's first of all, we have to clarify what you mean by decline, because numerically we are not in decline. The last census for which we have results was in 2001, and this showed an increase of 200,000 Catholics in Australia. What is slowly declining is the rate of practice. Our services are expanding, the number of students in our schools is slowly increasing, but for example, the percentage of Catholics who worship each week or each month has slowly declined. It's declined radically from 40 or 50 years ago, when about half the population went. Now it's 16 or 17 or 18%.
But then the word decline takes on another sense. How do you see the concern, let's say, for the Catholic Church in Australia, and how is the Church able or in a position to respond?
Well, we're concerned about the level of faith amongst our young people. We're concerned about vocations. churchgoers are dying and not a sufficient number of young people are replacing them. And what do you do about that? Well, the whole raft of things. One primary factor is to try to introduce adequate religious education programs so that the young people are being introduced to Jesus Christ, to the Gospels, to the Catholic tradition. The danger is that with bad religious education, they'll be inoculated against the true faith. They'll feel that they know what it's about when they really don't, and are never feel called or never aware that there is a call to a serious conversion.
Is there a relationship to the practice of the sacraments and the strength of the faith? And is there a decline in both the understanding and the practice in the sacraments and the relationship to the strength of faith?
Well, I mentioned that the rate of mass going has declined significantly. I suspect that I'm quite sure that the percentage usage of confession, going to the sacrament and reconciliation, has fallen away even more spectacularly. Now, obviously, people still continue to pray. We've done surveys of young people at school, young Catholic people. There's still a lot of prayer. There's still a lot of Catholic sensibility. But if you're not worshipping each week in a community, you're not approaching the sacraments regularly, obviously I think this represents a weakening of the faith. And this is reflected, I think, in all sorts of ways. Divorce rates, the low birth rate, the increasing percentage of people not getting married, drugs, alcoholism, pornography, all these things that afflict the Western world.
When we speak about decline, do we also understand, or is it the case to say that there has been a decline in the knowledge and the practice of the sacraments? And how is this reflected on the strength of the faith in Australia?
Well, it's always a bit of a mystery about how grace works. So to make a direct and straight connection as distinct from correlation is difficult. But I think if people are going to Mass less frequently, I think that's very likely to be connected with things like a rising divorce rate, a lower birth rate, a higher percentage of people entering into partnerships rather than marriage, and also problems like alcoholism, drugs, pornography, general sorts of things like that. So it's difficult to establish precisely how they're connected, but I believe that going to Mass is not worshipping regularly, praying regularly, is not an extra, but is something central to a life of faith, and weakens the life of faith and of morals.
One area which has seen a rise in Australia has been the number of people that have stated that they do not believe in anything anymore, and proportionally a number of these are ex-Catholics.
Well, yes, once again there's a slight clarification there. In the last census, the number of people who said they had no religion dropped from about 17% to 15.5%. I had expected it to rise, and so that was pleasant news. Now, a number of those people are ex-Catholics, but most of them are not. Most of the Catholics are not at this stage disaffiliating. Most of the people who say they have no religion are ex-Protestants or ex-Anglicans, although there is a number of Catholics there. So the situation is not entirely predictable.
The Church has suffered a catastrophic fall in the number of religious vocations to religious life. What happened?
Well, this is something that's not confined just to Australia. My fear in Australia was, even 20 years ago, that we would have a collapse on our hands, like the collapse in church-going that occurred in Holland, perhaps Switzerland, French-speaking Canada. Now, I think in most parts of Australia, I think we are avoiding that. There is a slow decline, but in some ways we have stabilised, we are rallying. Now, what's caused it? A whole host of things, many of which are beyond our control. The advent of television, the advent of the creation of adolescents, of teenagers, teenage markets, teenage music, these pagan pressures which are belting into our young people. All these, the biggest factors are factors beyond the control of the church.
Some have suggested that an answer to the falling in the number of vocations would be to open up, for example, the ideas of married clergy, greater roles of women in the church. How do you see this, and how would you respond to this?
I think the crisis is much more profound than that. For example, let me give you a counterexample from the Anglicans, where they have plenty of Anglican ministers, plenty of so-called women priests, but they can't afford to employ them. Many of them are unemployed. The crisis is a crisis of faith. It's quite profound. And the key to responding to that is to do what Jesus wanted. And I don't think that, and that is not to follow a path of further liberalisation. That's been tried in Holland and in other parts of the world, and the results have been catastrophic.
You stated in an interview that the Australian temptation is not to crucify Christ, but rather to trivialize him. What did you mean, and what reflection does this have on Australian society?
I think it shows the absence of deep, bitter hostility to the church. Now, there's some pockets of that, but there's not much deep hostility to the church. There's not much anti-clericalism, even after there's some, of course, after the sexual scandals. The Australian temptation is to believe that you can live a very good life, be a good person without God and without Christianity. Although many of the public attitudes in Australia are still inherently Christian.
The Ecclesia in Oceania document stated that the gospel must be heard in Oceania and the people have a right to hear it. Do you propose going back to traditional teaching of the church, or how do you see this responsibility of the church being enacted in Oceania?
Well, there's no particular virtue in being old-fashioned, especially if most of the population aren't old-fashioned. But we're followers of Christ. He lived 2,000 years ago. We believe he's the Son of God. And so he's brought us the Maker's instructions. And so the secret of any vitality is found in explaining what Christ is about. Now, we have to do that through every means that's available, for example, through television. But the secret is to explain the hard teachings as well as the easy teachings of Christ and the church. As Cardinal Ratzinger said, we're called to be the salt of the earth, not the sugar of the earth.
In Australia, like in many other countries around the world, is one of inculturation, the introduction of the faith to the local population. How do you understand inculturation?
Well, enculturation, I think, is the penetration of the culture by the gospel. Doesn't mean submerging the gospel by the culture. Now, Australia has got a higher percentage of migrants than any other country in the world. We're a very multicultural society. So we're only at the start, and Australian culture itself, we're a small derivative community, heavily dependent culturally in the past on Britain and Ireland, and now on the United States. So I think we've got a lot to learn from the other English-speaking countries as we make our own way and bring the gospel to bear on our society.
You also stated that inculturation is a long-term project in Australia. What did you mean by this?
Well, you have to know both your local culture and you have to know the Catholic culture. It's done, I believe, more by osmosis than by explicit ambition. It's something that goes very slowly, fits and starts. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes less successful. The important thing, though, is to preach Christ accurately and fully and in love, with courtesy and charity.
What advantages has enculturation brought, and at what cost?
Well, it's improved ecumenism. I think there's more social peace in Australia now than there was after the Second Vatican Council encouragement of ecumenism. There was a lot of sectarianism in Australia. It was often English, Protestant versus Catholic, but more British versus Irish. To some extent, to a very, very large extent, that has diminished. That's the positive side of things, and it's very, very positive. The negative side, the other side of the coin, is the danger that our Catholic identity will be weakened and we will merge into the semi-Christian majority. That's the danger.
You have recently been in the press regarding statements about Islam. What sparked your movement into this question, and why now?
Well, I think what's remarkable is not that I've said something about Islam, but that so many other people haven't. Because I think it's undoubtedly one of the major cultural challenges facing the Western world, as well as a political and possibly a military challenge. At the time of September 11, I didn't know much at all about Islam, and it's taken time for me to read and discuss and to do some work on the Quran, just to start to develop some sort of adequate view of what's happening. Now, what is really important is to identify what we're dealing with. See, a lot of people in Australia think that all religions are the same and they're all fairly useless and not particularly influential. That's not the case. Religions differ very, very greatly from one another, and religions can be enormously powerful influences. And we see that in Christian martyrs, Catholic martyrs. We see that too, for example, in Islamic fundamentalists.
Begging the question then, why was there such a reaction when you did come out publicly to make statements about Islam?
Well, there was something of a reaction. That's certainly true. I got a lot of letters, overwhelmingly supportive, And it was because other people aren't doing it. We should be discussing these things. The challenge is so fundamental that we've got to get it right. You can't plan what you're going to do if you really don't know what you're dealing with. And there's a broad spectrum within Islam, just as there is within Christianity. And I think our challenge is to support the moderate forces.
Do you think we've been underestimating the impact that Islam is having or will have in the coming years?
Yes, I do. And I think, especially in Europe, the major factor is demography. Because in Europe, Christians, well, not so much, yes, Christians, but Western secularists in particular, having so very, very few babies. The Islamic minorities are having quite a significant number of children over and above, sometimes 2 or 3 times the birth rate of Western secularists.
How do we respond?
Well, I'm not going to tell Europeans what they should be doing, but the first thing they should be doing is talking about the problem and about just what is necessary to maintain a coherent democracy.
And in Australia?
In Australia, it's a similar pattern. The number of Muslims is significantly lower than, for example, it is in France. And we've got about 300,000 Muslims in Australia. We have to encourage them to integrate into the society, but on Australian terms. I've said that they should come as migrants with all the strengths that they bring. They shouldn't come as colonials, wanting to leave nothing behind and to set up their own sort of society with us. Being a migrant, it means it's a give and take. And they've got every right to contribute to the democratic processes. As a Catholic Church leader, I feel obliged to see that as a minority they are not discriminated against, they are not the objects of abuse or maltreatment, but by the same token, of course, they have to show that, like us, they are good, loyal Australians.
Is it possible to dialogue with Islam?
It's certainly possible to dialogue with some Islamic leaders. I'm part of an Australian delegation that's gone a couple of times up to Cebu in the Philippines, to Yogyakarta, to deal with the religious leaders from all of Southeast Asia. Dr. Amir Ali was head of the Islamic Council in Australia. I'm certainly able to dialogue with him and many like-minded people with him, and this needs to continue.
And there are fruits?
Yes, well, we've had some riots in Australia, one so-called riot in Australia. That wasn't repeated. Basically, there are good relations.
You stated that you understood Pope John Paul to be a prophet of the Church and the world. How do you see his impact globally, but also for Australia?
Well, he was a great teacher. He presented the Catholic message. He presented the figure of Christ in every way he could. Through his travels, through his teaching, in a certain sense, he went over the heads of the local hierarchy, spoke directly to the people. Now, his role in the collapse of communism was profound, but also, given the dangers for dispersion, when he became Pope in the Western world, I think he had a very, very steadying effect, and he reminded us that the only way forward is fidelity to Christ.
How do you see Pope Benedict in these big footsteps?
Well, he's a much older man. He's a different personality. He's not such a large and charismatic personality, but one-to-one, in some ways, he's a better teacher. Now, for the last 10 years of his life, the Pope was so sick. But Pope Benedict is a brilliant teacher, a brilliant expositor of simple gospel truths. And he's proving to be very, very effective at that.
In 2008, Australia will host the World Youth Day. What hopes do you have for the World Youth Day for Australia?
Well, I hope it'll do two things in Australia. One, it'll reinforce the faith of the young Catholics, and also it will present Christ to the increasing number of young Australians who haven't got any firm or settled religious convictions. We really do have something to offer to them. That's the truth and beauty of the gospel. It works. And so I am speaking to young people overseas, and I'm inviting them to come to Australia, not just to strengthen their faith, but to help strengthen the faith of young Australians. And they understand what I'm saying, and they're very sympathetic to that, because one of the great things about being a Catholic is we're universal. We instinctively help one another across the countries. We take that for granted, but it isn't normal. You've only got to look at the Orthodox churches, their national churches. It's something very, very connected with the papacy, with the unity of the church, which our predecessors have worked so hard to build and to maintain.
You have known of aid to the church in need for many years,
Yes.
and its help to the suffering church. What importance, how do you see the importance of this charity in the universal church?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons. For the actual people who are suffering, it's a great consolation to them, not only to receive some practical help, but to realize that somebody is concerned about them. And also it's useful for the churches that aren't suffering, for the Catholics to be reminded that others are worse off.
So there's a sense...
And just like Paul had to collect for the church in Jerusalem, so we have to work to support one another.
So there's a sense of a bridge between the suffering and those who have, and a solidarity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is one of the things that's quintessentially Catholic, quintessentially Christian. And I mean, in the 20th century, more people died for their faith than in any other century in history. We hope that this coming century in which we've just started won't be as bad, but there are still lots of Catholics suffering in different parts of the world, and the Age of the Church in Need is doing a marvellous service in reminding us of that and bringing practical help to some of them.
Your Eminence, thank you for having been with us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us on our program. And if you'd like to know more about the situation of Catholics in Australia, I would like to encourage you to look at the contact information posted at the end of this program. And I look forward to seeing you next time on our program, Where God Weeps.